Hello and welcome. My name is Paul Czarkowski. I'm a developer advocate here at VMware. Today, I'm going to take you through a demonstration of CF for K8s, which is Cloud Foundry for Kubernetes. It is fast approaching GA, so we're about to hit 1.0.0. I believe we're at like a release candidate 1. So let's just do this, shall we? This is the CF for K8s GitHub repo. You can see here, code, but we're just going to have a look at the documentation. So CF push comes to Kubernetes. You're all familiar with Cloud Foundry and doing CF push. Some of you are probably also familiar with Kubernetes. This is basically taking the CF experience and building it on top of Kubernetes, switching in and out Kubernetes components and CF components as they make sense. So that's enough talking. Let's just get into the work. In order to install this, I of course need a Kubernetes cluster. And to do that, I'm going to reach for VMware's Tanzu Mission Control. Now, everything I'm doing can be done on top of a generic Kubernetes cluster, but I do want to get paid next week, so I will start with at least a VMware product. So this is Tanzu Mission Control. I can simply click in here, create a cluster, and then I want to make sure I use my credentials. And we will call this, just put my name there for sorting, and we will call it CF for K8s. And then I have a cluster group again, just to make sure that it's sorted. We can do some labels and stuff. We don't need to. I want to make sure I use a nice reliable region of Amazon, like US East 2. I have a couple of choices around my Kubernetes versions. This last time I did something like this, it was on, I think, 1.18. So I don't want to confuse things by introducing a new Kubernetes version at the last minute. I think the rest of the options we can leave as default. Control plane, this is just a demo. So I'm going to go for a single node. And then my worker nodes. Let's go for a M5 4 extra large. And we're going to have a fair bit of stuff running. So I'm going to make sure we have enough nodes. I'm just going to go ahead and ask for 5. 4x extra larges sound huge. So I'm probably going to get way more cluster than I actually need. You can deploy all of this to like a kind cluster, which is running on your laptop. So you don't need a ton of resources, but I also don't want to starve myself of resources and have everything run slow. So we'll go ahead and hit create cluster. And so now I get to sit back. I can go get a coffee, I can have a beer, and just kind of wait for our cluster to finish being provisioned. And so I'll see you in a few moments. All right, looks like we now have a cluster. And you can see we get a fair bit of information about our cluster. You can see that TMC puts a bunch of agents in there to help it manage a cluster. You can immediately see we have this many nodes at our disposal. These are the namespaces that exist, which should be just kind of our default namespaces. These are the workloads running. Again, this should be just the default stuff running in the cluster. And as I deploy stuff, this will actually fill out a little bit. The main thing I want out of here now is to hit access this cluster. And so it's giving me a config I can download. So let's go ahead and do that. And then I believe I want to copy that to config, and that should go into config. I believe that is what I want. So now you can see my context here, my prompt has changed. So if I do a kubectl get nodes, that looks like my new cluster. So now I have access to my cluster. I want to show you a tool I use a lot, which is called Octant. I'm even wearing the t-shirt. And so Octant is like a super high detailed Kubernetes dashboard. And so I generally disable the default dashboard and I use Octant. It runs locally on my machine and uses my creds, so it's less hackable than maybe some of the default Kubernetes dashboards are. And you can see I kind of get an overview of what's going on. I can look at, if I have more than one cluster configured, I can look at my namespaces, and then all sorts of details here. As I'm deploying stuff, we can see things happen. So we may come back here a few times and look what's happening. But let's go ahead and look at Cloud Foundry for Kubernetes. Done with, where is deployment instruction? Pretty well structured document. We have a bunch of required tools. So YTT and CAP. And these are part of Carvel or Carvel. I'm not sure how we're supposed to pronounce that. And these are tools that help you template and deploy Kubernetes manifests to a cluster. There's a number of tools out there that do that. And these are kind of the VMware opinionated set of tools for doing it. Obviously, we need kubectl, and then we need the CF CLI. And very important with the 1.0 version of CF for K8s, you do need to have version 7 or greater of the CF CLI. If you don't have that, you'll have a very frustrating experience like I did last time I went to test this out. So make sure you have the correct version of CLI. And then there's a bunch of information about your Kubernetes cluster. Now there's a couple of things going on. Pod security policies. Now, TMC does turn on pod security policies, and so we will need to work around that. And also TMC provides different ways of doing metrics than what CF for K8s is expecting right now. And so this setting here will definitely need to be turned on. So let's hope I remember to do these things as we go through. We need a container registry. So it tells you how to use Docker Hub or GCR, Google Container Registry. I will actually use Harbor, which I'm going to install to the cluster. And so actually, let's go ahead and do that. Before we install CF for K8s, we actually need a few things on your cluster. Now, you don't need these things, but I think they make it a lot smoother. So I have some Ansible, which is going to deploy a few things for me. It's going to deploy Harbor to my cluster. It's going to deploy external-dns, and it's going to deploy certificate manager. And those things are going to work together to make sure that my applications are accessible via DNS and have TLS certificates and somewhere for CF for K8s to store those images. So we'll make that full screen, and we will go ahead and run this Ansible command right here. That's going to go and deploy my stuff. So we hit that, and we should see it start to connect, and you can see it's starting to perform actions. I'm going to let this run through. It'll take probably around 5 to 10 minutes. All right, so while that's running, let's go ahead and set up our CF for K8s environment. So I have already done these steps here. I already have the CF for K8s repo cloned down locally. So what we need to do is run this command right here. And we need to pick a CF domain. Now I have a domain that is already registered on Amazon's Route 53, and my external DNS is set up to use it. So as long as I use the right domain here, let's move this off to the side. We'll grab this one instead. We'll go ahead and run this command, but we will replace this with cf4k8s.aws.paulczar, that's me, .wtf. That is my domain, and I'm going to go ahead and run that. Let's talk about what that did. So if we pop up to my text editor, we'll now have this in my temp directory. We'll have this a cf-values file. And these are the values that make this install of CF for K8s unique to me and my cluster. Here's that domain I put through, and it's giving me an apps domain. So this is where my apps will run. And it's giving me a bunch of passwords and credentials. Now, I'm not worried about you all seeing these because this is a ephemeral cluster. And as soon as I finish doing this demo, I'm going to delete it. And there's a bunch of certificates, TLS certificates, etc., for both ingress to come into the cluster, but also for the things inside to talk to each other. And so there's a lot of things being done here. Now, I don't really need to change any of these to get a working system. However, there is a few things I will do, and I have an existing file that has most of what I want. And so I'll copy those in. So you can see I have a bunch of settings here, and then I specify an app registry. And so this is the registry that's being deployed right now to my cluster. Details on my load balancer. Now I want to make sure I don't keep switching IP addresses. So I have a Elastic IP already created, and I'm telling it to use that. And then I'm also telling it to use cert-manager. And this will actually replace the certificates we just saw with ones that are created through Let's Encrypt that are actual real signed certificates. I get the lock and everything show up just fine on my cluster. And then everything below is roughly the same. So I'm going to go ahead and take this section here. Oh, and then I have these reminders here. So I will grab those as well. So let's flip these up to here and drop them into there. With that done, I'm going to run my first command, which I think is YTT. That's going to take, there's a bunch of manifests and templates in this config directory that will actually do the things I want. And I'll show you, I'll give you an example. So here I have use certificate manager for TLS. And so if I find the appropriate file here, you can see this is a YTT file, and it's kind of programming hidden inside of comments in your YAML. And so you can see here, I'm looking for that. Is this value set and is it true? If so, we're going to do these things. And so this is saying that from everything that you've rendered so far, I want you to find a secret named CF workloads, and I want you to remove it. Find one called CF systems, and I want you to remove it. And then I want you to create a certificate, and I want you to wrap in the system domain, and then a second certificate and wrap in the application domains, which there can be more than one. And so this will create certificates, which are a resource that certificate manager will manage and will actually go and collect Let's Encrypt certificates for me. And that's how I'll get real working certificates on my applications and my CF cluster. And so that's just an example of kind of how YTT works. And so let's pop back to our deployment instruction. So we ran that hack. We got the bits we needed. We've configured our registry. So next we're going to run YTT and we're going to create our full list of rendered Kubernetes manifests that have all of our values merged into them. So let's have a look where we're at here. Let's clear the screen. We're going to run this YTT command. So you basically give it a list of files or directories. So that first directory is config, and that's where all of the sources are. And then -f is my values file. So we're going to run YTT, and it's going to fail. Data values file, CF values to only have data values components. What did I do wrong here? Is it because I just did that? Yeah, okay. So one of the joys about doing programming inside of YAML comments is you do have to be pretty precise about the order in which you do them. So let me go ahead and run this command. I also want to create this namespace because this namespace is where CAP is going to keep track of my installation. All right, and we are done with our infrastructure deploy. So now we can switch back to Octant and have a look at what's going on. You can see we've got some extra namespaces, and the main one we're interested in right now is this Tanzu Container Registry namespace, which is where Harbor is sitting. So let's go ahead and go to, let me see, ingresses. And here is our Harbor ingress, and we want our registry. So we'll go ahead and grab that and then pump that in. And if it all went well, it should work, and it is working. And you can see we have our little lockbox up here because we have a real certificate that was created with Let's Encrypt. So we can now log into Harbor, if I remember my password. And so now what we want to do is we want to create a user. I'm going to call this CF for Kates. We don't really need to give it a real email address. We do need to give it a set password. And that password is sitting here. Now I could give it a different one and copy it across, but it's just easier to reuse the same one. So go ahead and create that. So now we now have a user for CF for Kates, and now we need to create a project, which is basically a repository for it to push to. So again, CF for Kates, keeping this simple. We do not want it to be public. which means we then need to add the CF4Kates user as a member of this project. Yep, that's the one we want. Well, now our registry is set up for CF4Kates to use. So let's pop back to our instructions here. Here's our cap deploy right there. This is going to take the manifests that we rendered out with YTT and apply them to our cluster with an application name of CF. But I also want to make sure we put it in my CF4Kates namespace. And so cap is going to connect to the cluster. It's going to basically do a big diff of what's on the cluster and what it's being asked to do. And then it's going to go through and install everything. And so if you run cap twice and nothing has changed, it doesn't actually need to do anything. If you only change one or two small things, it will only update those couple of things on the cluster. As you can see right now, ton of creates happening across the board. There's 3 or 4 namespaces, a bunch of deployments, pods. You know, it's installing Istio, it's installing UAA, it's installing Irini, all these other things. And so this, like everything else, is going to take a few minutes. You can see it's telling us, like, as it's doing stuff, like it's waiting on 22 changes, right? So it's already done 273 things successfully. All right, and that is finished running the cap. So now we have CF4Kates deployed in theory. Let's have a look back at our octant. So you can see we now have all these CF namespaces. And you can see they have Istio injection enabled, and that allows Istio to do its magic. CF system is where most of the interesting tools are. So let's jump through to there. So you can see we have a bunch of deployments, stuff like Irini, CF APIs, etc. Pick one at random. So you can see we can get a ton of detail about what's going on. One of the interesting views is this resource viewer. It is small because it's got a lot of stuff going on, but you can see that's our pod, and you can see it has various secrets and services and whatnot attached to it. And so you can kind of see that relationship built out in a graphical format. So now with this all deployed, we can bring up our instructions and see what our next steps are. So we got through that, configured DNS, and now in theory, because we have external DNS and cert-manager, this stuff should already be done. And so we should be able to jump straight to this right here. So let's pop to here and let's run this command. And then we remember our cluster was cf4kates.aws.polzar.wtf. And that is giving us an OK. That means we were able to at least talk to that, which if we look at, let's do that. So you can see if we just use HTTP, which is like curl, but a little bit richer, you can see we get a response from the Cloud Foundry API. And you notice I didn't have to do a -K or tell it to ignore certificates. We have a real working certificate and we have a real DNS. Now we're going to log in. And so I have a different version of YQ to what the instructions are expecting. So we need to fix this command up a little bit and that off. And then I think this actually goes after here. Nope, before we close there. And so what that should use YQ to look at my CF values and get my admin password and stick it into the command line here. And we have authenticated correctly. And so we're now talking to our cluster and we're authenticated to it. We have to do the usual create org space and set a target. So let's go ahead and do that. If all is going well, we should be able to push this example app that is sitting in the CF4Kates. It's a node app, and I think it's just like a hello world. So we'll go ahead and run that. And now this is the CF push you're all probably used to. You know it and you love it. So here you can see the build pack is done, and then it is starting the app. And then it has started. So we want to look for our route here, and we can do a HTTP of that. And we get a response, and that response is move permanently. Let's go ahead and do follow. And there it is, hello world. So that is our application. This is Cloud Foundry having work, right? And we can pop this up here and open this up in a browser window. And there it is working. So why don't we go ahead and call it there and say we did a good job, and hopefully you learned something. And if you want to do this at home, the instructions for deploying cfk8s to a kind cluster on your local laptop work really well if you have the resources to run it. So you want to kick the tires, that is a great way to kick the tires. It's also fairly simple to get installed and running on like GKE or Amazon's container service or whatever. So if you want to kick the tires and you have access to a Kubernetes clusters, go ahead and do roughly what I did. You can kind of skip some of the steps I did just for testing it out. You don't need to have a real domain. You don't need to have a real certificate, but I find that just gives you a little bit better experience when you enable those things first. And that's it. I'm done. So thank you so much for watching and following along with me. I hope you had fun, and I'll see you again sometime, hopefully in person.